Good. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight for our pre-Hanukkah talk. The oil lasted 8 nights. What fueled the Hanukkah miracle story? I want to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Simkovich. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight. I'd also like to thank Idana Goldberg, my co-chair for Adult Ed, for her work in helping to organize tonight's program. Now I'll share a few words about Dr. Simkovich. Dr. Malka Simkovich is the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and the Director of the Catholic Jewish Studies Program at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. She's the author of Making Jewish Universalism from Exile to Alexandria and Discovering Second Temple Literature, the Scriptures and Stories that Shaped Early Judaism, which received the 2019 AJL Judaica Reference Honor Award. Her articles have been published in the Harvard Theological Review and the Journal for the Study of Judaism, as well as in online forums such as the Lair House and the Times of Israel. She is involved in numerous local and international interreligious dialogue projects, which help to increase understanding and friendships between Jews and Christians. Now, before I turn it over to Dr. Simkovich, I'll just cover a couple of housekeeping items. First, tonight's talk is being recorded and will be posted to the Shul's YouTube channel in the coming days. Also, please feel free to input any questions you might have in the chat box as we go along. At the end of her prepared remarks, Dr. Simkovich will address as many as time permits during the Q&A session at the end. The program will end by 9:15. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Malka Simkovich.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers of this evening's event. And I'm so happy to be with all of you, if only virtually. Maybe one day we'll learn together in person, please God. Tonight's talk is going to ask a very classic question that many Divrei Torah, many speeches about Hanukkah begin with, and that is the question of how we get to the oil miracle story. Many of us know that this story doesn't appear until the 5th century, until the Babylonian Talmud tells us the story. But of course, the oil miracle doesn't have any surviving text that speaks about it in the Second Temple period. So how does this happen? Well, in order to understand how we get from a military victory, and many versions of this victory are circulating in the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century BCE, all the way up to the 5th century, when at some point it becomes a theological miracle about oil that lasts for 8 days. In order to understand this, we have to begin with a little bit of history. And what I'm going to do is share my screen. And now you should see a timeline in front of you. So I'm not going to go through this line by line. This is a 10-page source sheet, so don't get nervous. But it's very important, first of all, to undermine what I just said. Now, the classic binary is that in Second Temple sources, the story of Hanukkah is about a military victory. And in rabbinic sources, the story of Hanukkah is about a miracle. Now, this is actually not exactly the case. What we're going to see tonight is that Jews are theologizing the story of Hanukkah very, very early on. So as we look at the sources, starting from the 2nd century BCE all the way up to the 5th century CE, we want to look for those theologizing markers. We might not see an account of the miracle of the oil, but we're going to see efforts to theologize and imbue the story of Hanukkah with theological meaning from a very, very early from very early period. And the question that Jews are having as they're talking about the story of Hanukkah is, are we celebrating something new, or are we reinstituting something old? So in order to understand what this conversation is really about, we have to understand what's going on in the 2nd century BCE. When Alexander the Great dies in around 323 BCE, and he doesn't leave a will, his empire divides into 3 parts. We have the Ptolemaic kingdom in North Africa. We have the Seleucid kingdom to the north of Judea, and the Antiochus kingdom to the east of Judea, and that is Asia. So we have 3 major Greek empires in the 2nd century BCE. And right in the middle is Judea. Judea is prime real estate. It connects these 3 major empires. It is a trade route, and all of these empires want this tiny little territory of Judea. And so because Judea is so contested and borders these three empires, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are engaged in a series of wars in the 3rd century BCE for Judea. And this is called the Six Syrian Wars. Most of this time, from the time that Alexander the Great dies until the story of Hanukkah, most of that time, up until around 200 BCE, Judea is under Ptolemaic rule. And the Ptolemies, like the Persian Empire before, the Ptolemies largely practice religious tolerance. And so the first thing we have to understand is that even though we talk about Hanukkah as a culture clash between Judaism and Hellenism, Jews in Judea are living peacefully under Ptolemaic rule for 123 years before things go bad. And so I would argue, first of all, we need to question this assumption that this is a culture clash between Judaism and Hellenism. What we know is that when Judea shifts from being under Ptolemaic control to being under Seleucid control, and that happens in 200 BCE, that's when the troubles start. So in 200 BCE, Antiochus III takes over, and his son Antiochus IV Epiphanes is the one who in 175 BCE begins to issue these prohibitions against the practice of Judean ancestral law. And so we have a situation where Judeans are being persecuted in 175 BCE, but at the same time, there are Jews in other parts of the Greco-Roman world that are not being controlled by the Seleucids. We have Jews in Ptolemaic Egypt. We have Jews in eastern regions of the Antiochian Empire, and those Jews are okay. And in fact, in 175 BCE, when the war starts, the majority of Jews in the world are not living in Judea, and you have a very vibrant diaspora. And so how do you establish a holiday for all Jews to observe throughout the Greco-Roman world for perpetuity, forever and ever, when only a tiny majority of Jews experienced this war? Again, you have maybe a couple 100,000 Jews living in Judea. You have at least a couple million Jews living elsewhere. And so in order to argue, to make an argument for the holiday of Hanukkah, something that has to be celebrated every year, you have to market the holiday. And it's very interesting to see how Jews writing in Jerusalem are marketing this holiday to a Jewish audience. And in fact, you'll see something that might not be surprising now that we've sort of laid out the historical groundwork. And that is that the way that Hanukkah is marketed to the Judeans is very different from the way that Hanukkah is marketed to the diasporan Jews living outside of Judea, not under Seleucid rule. And so we have one eyewitness source, just one, that survives from the war, and that's 1 Maccabees. In terms of ancient sources about Hanukkah, there's very little. And I'm talking when I say ancient, pre-rabbinic. We have 1 Maccabees, we have 2 Maccabees, we have Josephus, and we have 2 letters that I'm going to talk about later on in the talk. So very little. Again, 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, Josephus, and a couple of letters. 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees are considered by many to be parallel accounts of the war, but in fact, they're very, very different. 1 Maccabees was written in Hebrew in the middle of the 2nd century or late 2nd century BCE, written in Hebrew in Judea. And the second Maccabees is written in beautiful, very, very high level Greek by a diasporan Jew from a place called Cyrene, which is in modern day Libya. And it's not originally written in Hebrew. In fact, there's almost no chance that the writer of 2 Maccabees even knew Hebrew. So you have a Judean text and you have a diasporan text. The Judean text is an eyewitness to the account. The diasporan text most definitely is not. And what you're going to see is that there are 2 stories about Hanukkah really that are circulating at the same time in the 2nd century BCE. The Judean writer of 1 Maccabees, who is an insider to the Hashmona'i court, to the Hasmonean court, and he's writing a pro-Hasmonean document that really is meant to affirm the legitimacy of the Hasmonean family. He is going to focus on the military victories of the Hasmonean family. And for him, or her, but probably him, we'll be honest, the holiday is a holiday that commemorates a military victory. In 2 Maccabees, the diasporan Greek text, the holiday is one that has theological significance for every single Jew, not only those who survived the war. But there's another difference between these two documents, and that is that in 1 Maccabees, the holiday is new. And in 2 Maccabees, the author makes an argument that this is not a new holiday. And so the question is why? How are they making this argument, and what's motivating them to make these different arguments? So it's an interesting, I can't do this line by line again, but I'm very happy to email this to you. I'm not sure if it was distributed before the talk, but if it wasn't, I'm happy to, some of you are nodding. Okay, so you should have this up. Okay, so one of the main arguments of the writer of 1 Maccabees is that the true enemy is not the Greek, right? Because again, you've lived under Hellenistic rule for about 150 years by the time the war starts in 175 BCE. The true enemy are those Judeans who are supporting the Hellenistic cause. And so if you look at this, the way that the author opens up the situation, the crisis of early on in the book, it's those people from Israel who are gladly adopting the religion of Antiochus for Epiphanes. It's those people from Israel who forsake the law, who join these Hellenizers, who do evil in the land. The focus of the book is on those Jews who are not properly adhering to their ancestral laws. You're going to see in 2 Maccabees that the real enemy is Hellenism. And in fact, the very first appearance of the word Judaism in Jewish literature in Greek is 2 Maccabees. This work doesn't have the word Judaism in it. The idea that Judaism is an ism is not self-evident in the Hebrew Bible, and we could talk about that during the Q&A. But this idea that Judaism is a self-contained religion, it's sort of a modern idea, modern if you're living in the 2nd century BCE. So in 2 Maccabees, you have Hellenism versus Judaism hurtling towards each other into an imminent culture clash. That's an argument that 2 Maccabees has to make. And that's not the picture that we are given in 1 Maccabees. In 1 Maccabees, the enemy are those, or is those Jews who are being loyal not to the practices of their ancestors, but to the practices of Antiochus for Epiphanes. But I want to take you to the end of the story when they establish this holiday. And I want to take a closer look at this. Okay, so towards the end of the book, they establish this holiday. And what is the holiday? Early in the morning on the 25th day, when I highlight, do you see that? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, it's in the month of Kislev, in the 148th year. They're counting from the Seleucid period that begins in 311 BCE. They rose, they offered sacrifice as the law directs on the new altar of burnt offering, okay? And they celebrate, they have songs and harps and loops and cymbals. There's great joy among the people, on and on and on. And this is called the days of dedication of the altar. Now, it sort of roughly correlates with the Hebrew word Hanukkah that we use today. But this is totally not the picture that we get in 2 Maccabees. So again, in 1 Maccabees, we have a military story, and then we have a rededication of the temple 12 years after the war begins. The war begins in around 175. It ends in around 164 BCE. And there's a new commemoration established. Now remember, 1 Maccabees is written for Judeans. It's written in Hebrew, and it's written to argue for the legitimacy of the Hasmonean, the Hashmonaim family. 2 Maccabees has a different objective. The goal of 2 Maccabees is to make an argument to the diaspora. And the argument to the diaspora is, this is a story that's relevant to all of you. And every Jew, even if they did not experience the military victory, has a stake in the story, because it's a story of God's everlasting covenant, of God's everlasting promises to protect all Jews. And so today it happened to the Judeans, and tomorrow it can happen to you in Alexandria, in Antioch, in Rome, wherever you live. And so here the enemy is Hellenism. The holiday, we're going to talk more about this in a few minutes. The holiday is not new, but it's old. And there's a de-emphasis on the military aspect and a much stronger emphasis on the theological meaning of the story. So this is late 2nd century BCE. So again, next time you hear somebody say, well, the Second Temple documents are military, and then the Talmud, the rabbinic documents are about the miracle, you have to complicate the binary, because only 2 generations after the war, Jews are theologizing the story of Hanukkah. And so the opening of 2 Maccabees begins with miracles. There are no miracles in 1 Maccabees because that's more of a reliable, technical, dry eyewitness account of the war. But the diasporan author of 2 Maccabees tells us about the miracles that happen. And some of these miracles, now you're not going to see miracle of the oil. So my assumption is that the author did not know this story, because if he did, he would have stuck it in. But there are other miracles that the author is very, very happy to include in 3 Maccabees. And one of the most interesting miracles that appears in this book lays out the entire story in advance. So at the very beginning of the war, there's an incident that sort of acts as a microcosm of the entire war, of the entire story that the author is about to tell. And so in this incident, a Seleucid general named Heliodorus goes to Jerusalem at the very, very beginning of the war to raid the temple treasury in Jerusalem. And this is a theme in Second Temple literature. There are actually a number of very interesting stories about bad guys trying to invade the temple. In fact, you could look up a book called 3 Maccabees, which is actually not about Hanukkah at all, but it's called 3 Maccabees. It's preserved in the Apocrypha. It's totally a different story about Jews in Alexandria, but there's also a trope of an emperor invading the temple treasury. And in fact, this actually happens in real life when the emperor Caligula in 38 CE, this is real, not literature, but Caligula in 38 CE tries to put a statue of himself in the temple and people freak out. So Jews were nervous about emperors invading the Jerusalem temple in the ancient world. We have real evidence that this occurred, and we have a lot of literature stressing out that it might occur. And so in this story, when the Jews hear that Heliodorus is coming to go to the temple and raid the treasury, they're freaking out. The priests prostrate themselves before the altar in their priestly vestments, and this is very Hellenized. You could imagine this being performed on a stage. It's very dramatic and there's pathos, right? He calls towards heaven, very different tone from 1 Maccabees, which is pretty dry and technical. So the priest calls towards heaven upon him who had given the laws about deposits and that he should keep them safe, on and on and on. And this is such a great line. Remember, this is Greek. 1 Maccabees is originally written in Hebrew. To see the appearance of the high priest was to be wounded at heart, for his face and the change in his color disclosed the anguish of his soul. I mean, it's so Hellenized, and yet it's so anti-Hellenist. That's the irony of this book. It's so Hellenized stylistically, but it treats Hellenism as an enemy in a way that no other Jewish text does. Terror and bodily trembling had come over the man, which plainly showed to those who looked at him the pain lodged in his heart. Okay, but what's great, so they're all freaking out. They're very, very upset. Heliodorus is coming to violate our temple. And then what happens? He's finally showing up, and he comes with his bodyguard, and then a miracle happens. Then and there, the sovereign of spirits and of all authority caused a manifestation, a vision, that all who had been so bold as to accompany him, all his little minions, were astounded by the power of God and became faint with terror. Why? What did they see? What was this miraculous vision? There appeared to them, to Heliodorus and his goons, a magnificently caparisoned horse, a horse prepared for battle, with rider of frightening mien. It rushed furiously at Heliodorus. Remember, this is a vision. This is not a real horse. This is like an angel horse. And it attacks Heliodorus. And then just as the rider on this magic angel horse attacks Heliodorus, 2 young men appear to Heliodorus, remarkably strong, gloriously beautiful, splendidly dressed, and they just start beating him up. And so you have this angel horse with this very scary rider running towards Heliodorus, and then 2 very attractive, good-looking angels just start beating him up. Heliodorus is so upset and shocked and traumatized that he runs away. Now, this little vignette that occurs at the very opening of 2 Maccabees really tells us the whole story, which is they tried to violate our temple. We were very, very, very scared, and God intervened. And of course, we are also told how the writer interprets the story. It's not really about a military victory. It's not really about the physical strength of any individual or any family. It's that God intervenes miraculously in the story. And that is the only way that we can understand the success of the Jews and their defeat over the Syrian Greeks. And so for 2 Maccabees, the story is about God's intervention and salvation, and not about a family that's imbued with incredible physical strength. But now let's go to let's keep going because I want to talk about the holiday that's established in 2 Maccabees and how it's different from 1 Maccabees. By the way, the apex of 2 Maccabees, the very, very center of the book, is chapter 7. And this is a famous story that most Jews know very well, but they don't know where it comes from. This is the story of the mother of the 7 sons, who the family, we don't know who her husband is, but she and her sons are told that they must violate their dietary laws on pain of death. And they say, fine, we are not going to violate our ancestral laws. And they're all tortured horribly and killed, and they become very significant martyrs in Jewish memory, and then actually as well in early Christian memory. So this is the first written iteration of this story. She's not called Hannah until the early medieval period. But in this story, she's anonymous. She has no name. And if you want to know something very gross and interesting for your next cocktail party, if you're ever curious as to why we eat fried food on Hanukkah, well, it might have to do with the fact that one of the sons of this woman is fried in a pan. But I will leave that for the Q&A because it's gross and requires more attention. So let's, again, very Hellenistic work. So there's going to be a lot of pathos and a lot of drama, and it's so performative. So it's not just that all the heroes are praying, but we're told in detail, they get on their knee, they raise their hands to God, they close their eyes. So the writers really posturing all of the heroines, as well as the heroes and the villains, in such a way that you really can envision this almost as being performed. Okay, let's go to the establishment of the holiday that occurs at the end of 2 Maccabees. Remember, in 1 Maccabees, we're talking about a new holiday. It's a military victory. The enemy is Jews who've Hellenized. Well, we have a very different picture over here. The celebration that takes place for 8 days, we don't have any idea that it takes place for 8 days because a vial of oil miraculously was ignited for 8 days. But it's observed for 8 days in the manner of the Festival of Booths. So that year and 11 years before, they were unable to celebrate Sukkot. And this was the holiday immediately preceding December, when they rededicated the temple in the 25th of Kislev. And so that was the most recently skipped holiday. And so they celebrate Sukkot that year in December. And so in 2 Maccabees, what they're not doing is making a whole new holiday. They're celebrating Sukkot in December. Why? Now, this is very clever, because they remembered how not long before, during the Festival of Booths, they'd been wandering the mountains and caves like wild animals. And so the author is infusing the war of 175 to 164 BCE with theological meaning by drawing a connection between the Jews who experienced this war and the Israelites who wandered the wilderness after their exodus from Egypt for 40 years. And so just like those ancient Israelites, the writer of 2 Maccabees says, these Jews of Judea, these poor Jews, had to hide in caves in the wilderness so as to not be killed. And because of that, we're celebrating a Sukkot-like holiday in December. But of course, because it's 2 Maccabees and it's written in high-level Hellenized Greek, he also has to give some very Greek details, carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches and also fronds of palm. And I love this because he totally kills 2 birds with 1 stone here. This does happen on Sukkot. And in fact, if you look at Nehemiah Perek Chet, when the Jews come back to Jerusalem right after the Babylonian exile, they quote in Nehemiah Perek Chet, Vayikra Perek Mem, which talks about all these indigenous fruits that you should take. So again, this is reminiscent of ancient biblical Israelite practice, but it's also very Hellenist. They offer hymns of thanksgiving to him who had given success at the purifying of his own place, and on and on. Now, what's also very interesting detail is in the ancient Near East, Sukkot is not just another pilgrimage holiday. It's a very, very significant holiday in a way that I think today Jews maybe aren't aware of. In the ancient Near East, Sukkot is associated with an ancient Near Eastern New Year's festival. And you can see allusions to this New Year's festival at the very end of Zechariah, in Perek Yud Daled of Zechariah. Zechariah envisions all the exiles being brought back to Zion at the end of days, and talks about the first thing that they're going to do when they come back from exile to Zion is they're going to celebrate Sukkot. We have some interesting evidence that this once was an agricultural holiday that was associated with the new year. Of course, all the 3 pilgrimage holidays in Tanakh were ancient Near Eastern agricultural holidays that are then co-opted and imbued with new meaning based on the early history of the Israelite people. So here we have this interesting association between this new holiday in 164 BC, the dedication of the temple, with Sukkot, with possibly some kind of New Year festival. And all this is going to be significant when we see some later literature about how Hanukkah develops. But the point here is the author has to market this holiday to a diasporan audience. And the way that he markets it, he says, first of all, this is not a new thing. This is just Sukkot. And you know Sukkot. You've done Sukkot. That's in our scriptures. You keep it every year. This is just Sukkot in December, because the Jews of Judea from 175 to 164 wandered the wilderness the way that the ancient Israelites did. And you know this, you're familiar with this story, people. So the first thing that 2 Maccabees does is he says it's not a new holiday, it's an old holiday. And this is not a holiday that's really about the military strength and prowess of the Hasmonean family. This is a holiday that's about God's intervention in our lives in such a way that he ensures our survival when logically we should not be surviving. And so there's a theological argument that's being made in 2 Maccabees. And remember, this is very early, this is late 2nd century BCE. But the incredible irony of the book, which I just want to restate again, is that this is a book that's written in Greek in the diaspora. And it seems more pious in a way than 1 Maccabees, because the author is struggling to imbue the story with some theological significance. And the irony of having such gorgeous Greek and using all, pulling out all the stops and using all the tricks, the drama and the pathos and the soliloquy and all the things that the best Greek playwrights did, and then saying, and Hellenism is horrible. It's just a delicious irony. And this is, again, the first book that we have that pits Hellenism, Hellenismos in Greek, with Judaios, with Judaism, Judaismos. So there's a lot going on in 2 Maccabees. And we have these 2 versions of the story that are circulating roughly at the same time and being transmitted, being copied, and they become very important to Jews in Judea and in the diaspora. So this actually doesn't help our question. How are Jews in the Greco-Roman world celebrating Hanukkah? Is it a Thanksgiving holiday in December, right? A Sukkot in December, a theological affirmation of God's everlasting promises to all of the people? Or is it something totally new and it celebrates the great glory and might of the Hasmonean, the Hashmonaei family? Which is it? So let's go to our friend Josephus Flavius, or Flavius Josephus, late 1st century CE historian. And some of you, I'm sure, know of Josephus. Many times when I'm teaching the writings of Josephus, I get a lot of negativity about Josephus because people know that he was a traitor in the war of 66 to 73 CE. And many times I get the question of, well, how could he be Josephus? He's totally not reliable. And I'm happy to talk more about this if anybody's curious in the Q&A session, part of this talk. I do take Josephus with a grain of salt, but I also don't regard Josephus as totally historically worthless. Josephus was captured in the war. He was a general, maybe not a general, but he led a garrison in the northern part of the country in 69 CE at a place called Jotapata. All of his men are massacred by the Romans in this war when just before the temple falls, and he's taken in chains from Jotaphat by a general named Vespasian. And according to Josephus's own account, he tells Vespasian, I see one day that you're going to become emperor. So according to Josephus's own account, he's a prophet because, of course, Vespasian does become emperor. But Vespasian, when he hears this, says, shut up, don't say that. Because if in the Roman world you proclaim to be an emperor and you're not, well, that can get you in a lot of trouble and you could be accused of treason. In any case, when Josephus is taken to Rome and then released and treated very, very well by the Flavian family, even taking upon the name Flavius, Josephus doesn't throw his heritage under the proverbial bus, but in fact, consistently makes an argument for the integrity of the Jewish religion. And so I don't read him as a traitor at all. I read him as someone who's very sensitive to anti-Jewish sentiments that are circulating in Rome and arguing constantly for the integrity of the Jewish religion. And Josephus writes 4 things. He writes a history of the Jewish people called Antiquities of the Jews. It's a 20-volume work starting with the beginning of Genesis. Massive work. This is his magnum opus. 12 volumes, massive. Then he writes a 7-volume work, a history of the Jewish war, called The Jewish War, 7 volumes. And even though this war lasts from 66 to 73 CE, 7-year war, Josephus starts his account in the 1st century BC with the Roman occupation of Judea. Josephus writes 2 other things. He writes a systematic defense of the Jewish religion called Against Appian. Do you hear my daughter calling? Do you hear that? Pardon me. Thank you very much. So he writes Against Appian, the first systematic defense of the Jewish religion, and then he writes an autobiography called Vita, which means life in Latin. Josephus writes an extensive account of the Hasmonean and the Hashmonite War from 175 to 164 BCE in Book 12 of Antiquities. And for him, this is a military story. He doesn't have a miracle of the oil, but he gives incredible detail about the story. And I only include a tiny amount of it, but I mean, pages and pages and pages of the war. And he clearly has 1 Maccabees. I mean, there's pretty much no question about it that he has 1 Maccabees. He probably has other sources too. It's not clear that he has 2 Maccabees, but he has 1 Maccabees, almost certainly. So he has just this massive amount of material regarding the Hasmonean War. But what's very interesting is what he says about what he says about the holiday in terms of its name. So in Book 12, he says the following. He says, this name, remember in 1 Maccabees, it's called the Days of Dedication. In 2 Maccabees, it's called the Days of Thanksgiving and the Day of Purification. It has 2 names. By the end of the 1st century, Josephus is writing the 90s CE. He's writing about 20 years after the war in Rome. And what does he say? He says, this holiday is called lights. How do we know? How do we know it's called lights? We don't have any evidence of this in 1 Maccabees or 2 Maccabees. So why is Josephus saying that this holiday is called lights? Now, this is going to be a very important hint, because this means that by the 1st century CE, there's something about the holiday that is connected with fire and light. But the amazing thing about this source is that Josephus doesn't know what it is. So he says they were so very glad at the revival of their customs when, after a long time of intermission, they unexpectedly had regained the freedom of their worship, that they made it a law for their posterity that they should keep a festival on account of the restoration of their temple worship for 8 days. From that time to this, we celebrate this festival, we call it lights. But that's not an answer. There's nothing in there about lights. There's nothing in there about fire. There's nothing in there about the menorah. Why? And Josephus says he has no idea. So he makes something up. I suppose the reason was, Josephus says, because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us, and that thence was the name given to that festival. He allegorizes it. He's like, well, we had darkness and then there was light, proverbially speaking. We were in trouble, so that's darkness. And then we got saved, so that's light. He has no clue, which means that we're dealing with an ancient tradition, right? If by the 1st century, the late 1st century, Jews are calling this a festival of lights and Josephus has no idea why, we're dealing with an ancient tradition already, that there is some association between Hanukkah and fire that's not clear to everybody. That's not clear to Josephus, certainly. Now, can we find this kernel, this little nugget of information that clarifies to us what the connection between Hanukkah and fire, or Hanukkah and lights is? And I think that we can find that connection. So this is the most exciting part of the talk, because here I think we find the source for the miracle of the holiday story. Copies of 2 Maccabees, as they were being circulated in the 1st century BCE, did not open up right away with the text. The work of 2 Maccabees has a very complicated transmission history. It was actually a 5-volume work. It was massive. And that work is lost to us. We don't have it anymore. In the very end of the 2nd century BCE, a condenser, some editor, saw this big, amazing Greek Hellenized, anti-Hellenist work and said, this is an incredible book. I'm going to condense it. And what we have today is the condensed version of that lost 5-volume work. So the writer of 2 Maccabees, we don't have that original work. We have a condensed 15, maybe 16 chapter, I can't remember, but quite brief work of what once was 5 massive volumes. And in the early 1st century BCE, an editor or a scribe who's copying over this condensed version of 2 Maccabees, of course it's not called 2 Maccabees at this time, a scribe who's copying over this work says, you know what? I know of these 2 letters that were written by Judean leaders in Jerusalem to the Egyptian community in Alexandria, the Jewish community in Alexandria. And these letters are so interesting to me, and they are so relevant to this work of 2 Maccabees. Again, I don't know what they called it because it wasn't called 2 Maccabees in the early 1st century BC, but the scribe says, these 2 letters are so interesting to me and they're so relevant to the book that I'm actually copying, I'm going to put them in at the beginning of the work. So if you open up any work of 2 Maccabees, you can find it easily online, right? It's preserved in the Apocrypha, so it's in the Catholic Bible. Any work of 2 Maccabees doesn't open up with 2 Maccabees. It opens up with 2 letters. And 2 Maccabees actually starts in chapter 2, verse 18. What are these letters? These letters are the clue to understanding, I think, exactly how we get from this military story to this theologized story about lights. The first story is written in 124 BCE. We know that because, incredibly enough, we actually have the date in the letter. And in this story, the writers, again, Jerusalem writers who are writing to Jews living in Egypt, again, just like 2 Maccabees, they're marketing the holiday to diasporan audience, and they can't do it by saying there's this really important war, right? Because the war didn't happen to them, but they have to make a theological argument. So they have to say this means something to you. So look at this, it's quite short. The Jews in Jerusalem and those in the land of Judea, to their Jewish kindred in Egypt, greetings and true peace. And this is written in Hebrew probably, or maybe Aramaic. May God do good to you. May he remember his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. May he give you all a heart to worship him and to do his will with a strong heart and a willing spirit. May he open your heart to his law and commandments. Very beautiful. Okay, very typical way to open up a letter in ancient times with this elongated blessing. In the reign of Demetrius, we wrote to you in the 169th year. So again, remember I said that at this time, Jews are counting from the beginning of the Seleucid era. So that's 311 BC. So this is in 143. So this is going to get complicated. This letter is written in 124. I know that because they say that it's written in the 188th year from 311. Remember, we're counting down. So this letter is written in 124. But they say back in the time of Demetrius, in the 169th year, so back in 143 BCE, we wrote to you in the critical distress that came upon us in those years after Jason and his company revolted. I'm not going to go through the whole history of this, but there's a lot of very interesting scholarship on what they're talking about in this story. But we wrote to you back in 143 BCE, 20 years ago, and we prayed to the Lord and we were heard. We offered sacrifices and grain offerings. We lit the lamps. We set out the loaves. And so now we're writing to you again. We wrote to you 20 years ago and we were having some trouble with some Hellenized Jews, even after the war was over. But now we're writing to you again, and we're writing to you with a request. And what's the request? See that you keep the festival of booths in the month of Kislev. So just like 2 Maccabees, remember this is appended, right? This is attached to 2 Maccabees, but just like 2 Maccabees, we're not dealing with a new holiday. We're dealing with the festival of booths, Sukkot, in December, in Kislev. So please remember our relationship, right? Remember that we have this ongoing relationship with each other, that we have a connection, that we're all one people, right? That's what this whole elongated blessing is doing over here. And just reminder, friendly reminder, please keep this holiday, this old holiday, all it is the Festival of Booths in December. Now, there really isn't a mention here of the military war. There's no mention here of the Hasmonean family, right? just the Festival of Booths in December. So there's an assumption that the Jews in Egypt have some information already about what this holiday is. They don't need to know the whole history. And that history is not really central to the interests of this letter. We have another letter as well, which is absolutely fascinating. And it's a very, very, very long letter. And this letter is quite tough, and we can't do it all line by line, but I would definitely encourage you to take a good look at this after the talk. This letter is set in 164 BCE, but scholars think that there are some historical problems with that date, and scholars think that this is a forgery actually, and written at the very end of the 2nd century BCE. But why do I say it's set in 164 BCE? Because look at this opening introduction. The people of Jerusalem and of Judea and the Senate and Judas. Who is writing this letter? Who is this letter attributed to? None other than Judah Maccabee. So this letter seems to have been written, and scholars are divided over this question. There are a few scholars who say that this is the genuine letter written by Judah, but most scholars say, no, this is actually written by a later Hasmonean. And I can give you a little bit more historical detail on that if you're interested later in the talk. But right now, for our purposes, what's important, that there are leaders in Jerusalem who are writing to Jews in Egypt at the end of the 2nd century BC, saying, keep this holiday, keep this holiday. And here we have, again, not an emphasis on the military victory, but a theological argument to observe the Festival of Booths. But not only the Festival of Booths, also the Festival of Fire. What is this Festival of Fire? We've never heard of this. Festival of Fire, we don't have that in 1 Maccabees. We don't have that in 2 Maccabees. We have something later in Josephus, in the end of the 1st century, about the Festival of Lights. But we don't have anything in the 2nd century about fire. What is this? Are these 2 separate holidays, the Festival of Booths and the Festival of Fire? This is a very, very significant letter because it points to a transition that Jews who had been thinking about Hanukkah as Sukkot in December begin to think about it as something else as well. And so what are they thinking about? Well, there is actually a miracle of lights in this letter. And so what is the miracle of lights? It's not a vial, a tiny vial of pure oil lasting for 8 days, but the author tells a story, and it's a story about miraculous fire. What's the story? And again, you could look at this all on your own, but I'm not going to do it line by line right now. The story is back at the very, very beginning of the 6th century BCE, at the beginning of the exilic period, when Judah is falling to the Babylonian Empire, and Nebuchadnezzar, is conducting a forced exile of all the Judeans, and the temple is about to fall in 586 BC, when the Jews are being dragged out of their homes from 597 to 586 BCE. As they're leaving Judea, Yirmiyahu the priest, tells a bunch of other priests, take some fire from the temple before the Babylonians destroy it. Take some fire from the altar and hide it. It doesn't say in this verse that it's Yirmiyahu, but he's identified later as Yirmiyahu. So the pious priests of that time take some fire from the altar of the first Beit HaMikdash just before it falls to the Babylonians. And they hide it. And what happens many years later, after the Babylonian exile ends, and Nehemiah is bringing 43,000 Judeans back to Judea to establish the 2nd Beit HaMikdash, Nehemiah knows about the story. He knows that the priests had hidden some fire from the first temple. So what does he say? He says to some priests, go find that fire. Find the fire from the first temple, and let's put it on the temple when we rebuild it. So they say, great. The only problem is they don't find fire. They find a thick liquid. So what is this thick liquid? They don't know. It's a strange, gooey, gloopy liquid. What do? Nehemiah says, take it out, take this thick liquid out, and just spread it on the altar. See what happens. So they do that. The materials for the sacrifices are presented. And Nehemiah tells the priest to sprinkle the liquid on the wood. And then they just let time pass. And over time, what happens? The sun, which had been clouded over, shines out, and a great fire blazes up, so that all marveled. And this is a miraculous sign that God found favor with this newly reestablished, rebuilt temple. And so there's enormous celebration. A miracle has occurred. The temple, the fire that was hidden away by the priests hadn't lasted, but there was some special liquid that did. And so they put that on the altar and it miraculously ignited. This is very, very, very similar to the story of the vial of oil that shouldn't have lasted for 8 days, but did. It's not the same story, but it's a very similar story. It's a story about a miracle in the temple pertaining to fire. Everybody's so excited that God has miraculously demonstrated his favor of the people. And so the high priest, Jonathan, leads this beautiful hymn to praise God. And they all sing, and it's incredible and amazing. When this is done, a flame blazes up again miraculously. When the light from the altar shone back, it went out. Okay, now the story begins to spread, and even the Persian king says, wow, this is really an incredible thing. You have to, you have to build and protect this temple very, very carefully, and you have my blessing to do so. Now, the letter doesn't end there. The letter keeps moving back in time. The argument of the letter is not just that there's one incident in the temple that's really miraculous, but in fact, there's a continuous series of miraculous events. He starts with the most recent one, and then he moves back and back and back and back. So he says that this miracle happened in the time of Nehemiah, in the early Second Temple period. And then he takes us back to Yirmiyahu, and he says Yirmiyahu was the one who had told those priests to hide the altar. And he was the one who foresaw that a miracle would be done with that fire. But the story doesn't really start with Yirmiyahu. In fact, it starts with Solomon, with Shlomo, who dedicated the temple, the Beit HaMikdash. But actually the story doesn't start with Shlomo. It starts with Moshe, with Moses, because Moshe was the one who first prayed to God and fire came down from heaven miraculously and consumed the sacrifices. It could be that this is a reference to Exodus 24 to Shemot Perek Chav Daled. But in any case, this isn't just a story about the people in 175 to 164 BCE. This is a story also about the generation of Nehemiah that came back from exile and rebuilt the second Beit HaMikdash. But it's not just a story about Nehemiah and the people from exile who came back to Judea and rebuilt the Beit HaMikdash. It's also a story about Yirmiyahu, the very last generation of Jews who lived in the time of the first Beit HaMikdash. It's not just a story about Yirmiyahu, but also Shlomo, but also Moshe. And so what this letter does is it creates a continuum of divine providence and protection over the people that imbues the Hanukkah story with theological significance and places it onto a continuum of stories that argue for God's protection. But the really significant thing about this letter is that it's a story about diaspora Jews. That's the key, right? Because Nehemiah is a diasporan Jew shepherding 43,000 Jews back to Judea, and they are beneficiaries of this incredible miracle. And so the message of this letter is, this is not a story about something that happened to us, to we Judeans. This is a story about something that happened to you, diasporan Jews. And because this is a story about diasporan Jews and the protection that they enjoy at the hands of God, this is a holiday that you need to honor. And this is a holiday that you need to observe. And so the holiday becomes universalized in a way that's fully articulated. And not in a way that you see in 1 Maccabees or 2 Maccabees, but this little letter that a scribe appended to the book of 2 Maccabees in the beginning of the 1st century BCE provides us with a very, very important clue that there were stories about miracles happening in the Beit HaMikdash pertaining to fire at the time of Hanukkah. Now, the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, gives us a very, very different picture, right? We do have this miracle story, but we don't have the context. Right? We don't have the war. We don't have the HashmonaI family. We don't have any military aspect here. We just have a miracle story about oil, the menorah, and fire. When the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled the oils. The Hashmonaid dynasty, we see them, but we don't really have information about the war here. They made search, they found only 1 cruse of oil, which lay with the seal of the high priest, right? And a miracle was wrought, and they lit the lamp for 8 days. But you don't have the context, right? The way that you have the context in 1 and 2 Maccabees, and the way that you have it provided, especially in these 2 letters appended to 2 Maccabees. Now, again, remember I said at the beginning of this talk, the binary really doesn't work. The binary between Second Temple sources being about the military aspect of the holiday and rabbinic sources being about the theological aspect of the holiday. I've shown you sources tonight that show Second Temple sources, very, very, very early sources, theologizing the story in a way that demonstrates very little interest in the war. Likewise, there are rabbinic texts that do talk about the war. So on both ends, you have both aspects. In Second Temple sources, you have both military and theological material, and likewise in rabbinic texts, not in the Bavli, but in the liturgy. In the liturgy of the Shemona Esrei that we say every day of Hanukkah, multiple times a day, we have the special liturgy that really does seem to commemorate the war, right? I mean, look at this. I could read it in Hebrew or English. In the days of Matityahu, the son of Yochanan, the high priest, the Hashmonai, blah, 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 when the wicked kingdom of Greece stood against your nations to force them to abandon your Torah, to remove them from the statutes of your will, you in your great mercy stood in their defense at the time of their troubles. And this is quite extensive. You fought their battle. You judged their judgments. You avenged their avengement. You placed the strong in the hand of the weak and the many into the hands of the few. I mean, this really is about the war. This is not about the oil miracle. This is not about some mysterious liquid being placed on the altar. That story becomes lost. We don't have that story in the rabbinic period. So what's going on here? Now we're back to the military aspect, but look at this. This is not like 1 Maccabees at all. Remember, 1 Maccabees is an eyewitness account of the war. This is not like 1 Maccabees at all, because 1 Maccabees valorizes the Hasmonai and the Hashmonai family. 1 Maccabees is all about legitimizing the authority of the family of Matityahu. This is not about the Hashmonaim at all. You, God, you achieved the victory. Ravta et rivam, danta et dinam, nakamta et nikmatam. And so even if the Hashmonaim were fighting the war, they were only instruments in your hand. You're the reason we won the war. And so in fact, this is an undermining of 1 Maccabees, because we are minimizing the independent strength of the Hashmonai family. God, you are the one who achieved that miracle. So it's sort of neutralizing. It's like it's neutralizing the independent power of the Hashmonai family. And I think it's doing that for a few reasons. I think first of all, only 2 generations after the war, the Hasmoneans are Hellenized. So even though we think about them in modern times as great heroes, arguing, defending the integrity of the Jews and their ancestral traditions, the truth is that is very short-lived. And by the 130s, the Hasmoneans themselves are Hellenized. And so the rabbis really don't have such great love for the Hasmoneans. And so we're not going to uphold them as the greatest righteous men of their time, A. B, this is, quite a late liturgical document, but really by the 2nd century CE, the rabbis are not interested in valorizing insurrection. There are so many rebellions that end so badly. In the 1st century, of course, we have the Jewish rebellion against the Romans in 66 to 73 CE, but that's not the first rebellion against Rome. Josephus tells us that there are rebellions in the 30s CE and the 50s CE. In 115 to 118 CE, the Jews rebel against Trajan. This is called the War of Kitos, or the War of Quietus. And of course, Bar Kokhba in 132 to 135. There are many, many Jewish rebellions against the Roman Empire. Why? I think it's because they're trying to have another Hanukkah story. We have this unlikely victory. There's no reason that we should have won in 164 BC, but by some miracle we did. Maybe God will make another miracle for us. And by the time Bar Kokhba happens and hundreds of thousands of Jews have been massacred by the Romans, the rabbis say, enough. We're not advocating for any more rebellions. That's not what this holiday is going to be about. This holiday is not going to be about valorizing rebels against the occupying host government. This holiday is going to commemorate God's intervention in our lives, whether we're in Judea or in the diaspora, and how God keeps the covenantal promises which ensure our survival. And so when we remember the military aspect of the holiday, we remember it as God's victory. We're not going to rebel, but God, when you save us, we thank you. Now I want to include a very, very interesting little text from Pesikta Rabbati, an early medieval midrash, and there's a parallel in Megillat Ta'anit, but I'm not going to read them both. They're almost identical. But this is a very interesting fusion of the theological aspect of Hanukkah and the military aspect of Hanukkah. I just think it's quite fascinating, and I don't know of an earlier source that attests to it. Why do we kindle lights on Hanukkah? Because when the sons of the Hasmoneans, the high priest, defeated the Hellenists, they entered the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, and they found their 8 iron spears. And they stuck candles on them and lit them. And so in this little line, you have both the military story and the theological miracle, because the Hasmoneans go into the temple and they find the weaponry of the Hellenists, and they transform these objects of physical harm. They transform these weapons. It's kind of like Isaiah says, where the weapons are transformed in the end of days into plowshares, and they transform these into something that elevates the event and celebrates God's victory. And so this is a really nice transformation of the military aspect of the story and sort of subjugates it to the theological aspect and the miracle of Hanukkah. So I think that by the end of the rabbinic period, we definitely do have a suppression of the military story, and putting it into a historical context reveals why. But I don't think that the miraculous aspect of Hanukkah is rabbinic in origin. I actually think that it's quite ancient, and that by the 2nd century BCE, really just after the war, these stories are circulating. Stories which theologize the miracle, which somehow have to do with lights and fire and the menorah, and stories which tell Jews wherever they live, this is relevant to you because it's a story about God's care and protection of all of us. So I'm going to stop the share. And it's exactly 8 o'clock, and I'm going to take a look. I haven't had a chance to look at the, I don't see any questions actually. Sounds Zoroastrian, but if there are any questions, I'm very, very happy to take them now.
And if you raise your hand or just unmute yourself, you can ask questions.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself.
I have a question.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I'm just wondering, what are the earliest manuscripts of 1 and 2 Maccabees? And how do we date them?
So the books of Maccabees are preserved in the Septuagint, and the Septuagint is, of course, the Greek translation of the Torah, but then it becomes the translation of the Hebrew Bible, and then we have these additional texts that are preserved in Greek by the church, and our earliest copies of those are 4th century.
That's pretty early.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And then I would ask another question about what we normally say on benching of that about Hanukkah. That was 9th century.
That's approximate. Oh, wait, you're coming out. I don't hear you.
your audio cut out, Esther.
It's a phone call. I said, no, what we're saying, what we're adding, 9th century from the Rabbeim. Where does that information come from? Because it's not in the text that you presented to us.
Liturgical material?
Yeah.
I don't know. I have to find out. I don't know. What's the earliest manuscript that preserves that material?
As you said, you dated in 9th century, which is around, quite a bit later than everything else.
Oh my gosh, I'm blanking. No, it's quite late. I don't know. I don't remember what the earliest manuscript, but I'm going to make a note to myself and look that up, and I'm going to give
because
you email address.
As I say, it adds information which was not present before.
Sure. I don't know. I'm trying to think. What would that be? I'm going to look it up for you.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Malka, can I ask a question? Hi, it's Rabbi Martyr. I want to thank you for presenting this evening and really very thought-provoking talk. I had a question for you just about, I didn't see the full line that the letter of Yehuda himself was making. It was fine. Why was he urging for a festival? We're filling in the blanks, but he's urging for a festival that celebrates something that Nehemiah did without saying that and it happened to us too. but you're saying this kind of implicit in the letter that something similar happened to him, maybe, could be, or why was he so interested in having the Jews of the diaspora celebrate Nehemiah's miracle now?
So I think that they are asking the diasporan community in Egypt to celebrate a festival that commemorates the Hasmonean victory in 164. So I think that they are. But they're saying, right, that this is not something that's new, but it's connected to something older that happened. Now, what's interesting, I'm writing an article about this. This is not the only such letter that we have from Judea to the diaspora asking the Jews to do things like this. In fact, there's a whole genre of letters called festal letters, where Judeans are writing to the diaspora saying, keep these things. And the question is, why are they so invested? And they're invested especially in the Jews of Egypt. And it's very interesting that there are about 1 million Jews in Egypt in the 1st century BC. Who are these Jews? How do they get to Egypt? What kind of Jews are they? Are they assimilated? Are they not? But Judean leaders in Jerusalem are deeply, deeply invested in this community and write to them regularly. So we know that there was correspondence outside of these 2 letters. But I think that this is not outside the story of Hanukkah. I think that he's just saying that there are more ancient occurrences of things happening that are miraculous in the temple. And so this is just the most recent manifestation of these miraculous occurrences. And then he takes you back into earlier accounts and saying, we're just the most recent recipients of this.
But he doesn't actually reference, other than he does not reference what happened to them. We're just kind of imagining something about lights as well, right?
Well, not exactly, because I can share the document again, but the beginning of the letter talks about Antiochus, right? So when you look at the very, very beginning, it talks about the miraculous death of Antiochus. So there is a framework of the letter that situates the writers in their own particular historical moment. So, it says, having been saved by God out of great dangers, we had this miraculous situation where Antiochus for Epiphanes was killed. There's some actual historical error in this, which tell scholars that maybe this wasn't written in 164, but in any case, there is an allusion to the story. And the question is, what are they saying at the end when they say we're about to celebrate the purification? Is that the purification of the temple in 164, or is that some older holiday? I think that there is intentional ambiguity, but I also think that they're very conscientiously trying to situate their own story into a longer story, saying we're the inheritors, we're the recipients of this pattern of miraculous divine intervention with the temple, but we want you to know that this is relevant to your story and that you have a personal stake in it.
I just had a question that was not quite directly in the topic, but you mentioned the story of Josephus, and I wondered about the parallel between his story, or the story of him addressing Vespasian as the emperor, and also in the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who does the same thing.
Yeah.
Obviously, it can't be coincidental that the
No,
same story is told about both of them.
Yeah, no, there's actually some really fun scholarship about this. There are some fun articles I could send you about rabbis or Jews having these legendary encounters with the emperors. What does this mean? In fact, we have these incredible dialogues between Rabbi and Antoninus in the Talmud. I mean, very lengthy dialogue. So there's a lot of very fascinating scholarship. Look, I think that the whole conversation, I can't speak to the Yochanan ben Zakkai, very, very famous story, of course, when he asks for Yavne and its sages. But certainly I'm comfortable saying that the Josephus story is legendary. Josephus repeatedly, and again, I don't like trashing Josephus because I think he's a very important eyewitness, mainly because he's like our only eyewitness to the war. But when Josephus implies that he's a prophet, I just get a little skeptical. And repeatedly in his own autobiography, like any autobiography written in the Greco-Roman world, you're not talking about an objective account of one's own life. It's sort of like a self-encomium. An encomium, one of these like very lengthy celebrations, a biography that's more than a biography. And so when Josephus sort of does that for himself, you can be a little suspicious, right? We know the end of the story. We know that Vespasian becomes general. And then of course his son Titus becomes general, and Titus's brother Domitian after him, who by the way is very, very horrible to the Jews in 90s CE. So I would take that with a grain of salt. And yes, there's a legendary trope in this early Jewish literature about these figures encountering the Roman emperors. And so I don't think that that's a coincidence. I think that that is a literary trope that is quite fascinating.
Everybody knew you had to say that to Vespasian when you met him. That's the other possibility. But I doubt. I think you're right.
The way Josephus retells it is that Vespasian is not having it, because it doesn't work well for him at that early stage of his career. Nero hasn't committed suicide yet. So Nero commits suicide, and then we have the year of the four kings in 69. And then Vespasian really becomes emperor because of how he treats the Jews. He asserts himself, in times of instability, people vote for well, I don't have to make contemporary parallels. I'm not going to. But Vespasian shows his military cruelty to Judea. And this impresses people because it's a time of worry and instability in the Roman Empire. All these emperors in the early and mid first century, they're killing themselves or they're just totally checked out, like Tiberius, Caligula. I mean, these are not great leaders. And so after Nero, who's also, has his own issues, the people want a general, and Vespasian uses Judea as an opportunity to prove himself in quite a shocking, very, very strong way. And so that hasn't happened yet when Josephus is taken in shackles, and Josephus is walking this tightrope because he's commissioned to write these works by the Flavian family. So he has to sort of flatter them, but he doesn't want to over flatter them. And so you have to feel a little sympathy for Josephus.
Thank you.
Sure.
Are there any more questions? In that case, Malka, thank you so much for
Thank you
speaking to
very,
us
very much.
tonight. This was amazing, really fantastic. So thank you, and happy Hanukkah to you and to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for
Malka.
having me.
We look forward to inviting you to come join us in person over Shabbat in the coming years. As I said when I reached out, we love to have scholars in residence, and it was a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you. I would love to do that and have a wonderful Thanksgiving in December, day of purification, day of dedication, and holiday of lights.
Happy
Thanks.
Hanukkah.
Happy
Happy
Hanukkah. Good
Hanukkah.
night, everybody.